Okay. Hi, everybody. Um, Welcome again. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Let me share my screen with you. Um, boop, there it is. Okay. Um, I wanted to. I'm still sort of searching for is the best way to handle the questions, because last time I found myself doing a little like I kind of like scrolling through trying to find stuff. So the way it's set up right now is if you put things in the chat, you can send them to one of three people. That is the three current co-hosts. One of them is Kelly, one of them is Joel, and one of them is named Sarah. And I would like all of your questions, if possible, to be directed towards Sarah, because she is going to be managing my questions so that I don't have to like try and figure out what's going on all the whole way through. Okay, so if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, but please send them not to me or Kelly, but to Sarah, and they will get to me, I promise. Okay, good. Um, so let's see, where were we? The last time we were together, we were looking at, we looked very closely at Genesis 1. And at the end, we commented a little bit on some of the differences between the creation account in Genesis 1 and the creation account in Genesis 2. And today, we get to really get into the creation story of Genesis 2 itself. This is Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. And we think that this story is like super famous and important. And it may be for us, but it is worth noting that, at least as far as we can tell from the evidence of the rest of the Hebrew Bible, this story was of almost no importance to anyone else in ancient Israel aside from whoever wrote it. Right? I believe that there is maybe one other reference to Adam outside of this story in the outside of Genesis in the entire Bible. A really quick little note in the book of Job, and Eve never is mentioned again in the Hebrew Bible. So just something to think about, sort of as we start, and in fact, as we go along. It's not necessarily the case that the stories that we think are the most important and the most sort of valuable and the most authoritative have always been that way, right? Which stories have risen to the top of our consciousness is uh, is a matter of sort of the history of interpretation and where someone in that sort of long history has pointed to a particular story and said, we're going to focus on this one. This one's going to be super important to us, when it may not have been, back when these were written. Okay, so you may remember that we ended last time. I said that I thought that Genesis 1 was sort of like was probably not a native Israelite creation story. It was probably originally from Mesopotamia as a sort of story. And in part, that's because the watery, chaotic, original state of the world just doesn't feel very Israelite to me. It's the same reason, really, we'll get to this next week in part, it's the same reason that I would say we know that the flood story also didn't originate in Israel, because who in ancient Israel or modern day Israel would ever think that flooding was a divine punishment? Uh, by that standard, no one had ever suffered divine punishment because Israel doesn't really suffer flooding. Um, Nowhere else in the Bible, for example, does flooding occur in any of the lists of divine curses or punishments, right? When God says, if you disobey, I will do X, Y, and Z to you, flooding is never on the list. What's on the list, right, the typical Israelite punishments, are droughts and famines, right? Usually one leading to the other. So Genesis 2 is what a native Israelite creation account looks like. Right? So it begins by telling us that nothing is growing. Nothing is growing on the earth because there's no rain. All right. Now we're in Israel. Right? Nothing's growing, there's no rain. And it tells us right off the bat, agricultural production requires human effort. Right? there was no human to till the soil, so nothing was growing. Nothing grows without human effort. Now, think back for a second, though, to Genesis 1, right? In Genesis 1, we were told that the earth just brings forth vegetation, right? Just all on its own. Well, not here in Genesis 2, my friends. Oh, no. Genesis 2 is the creation account of people who live in a setting like this, right? This is what people who live in here write a creation account where it's dry and there's no rain and it takes human effort to grow things. So the state of the world here in Genesis 2, unlike Genesis 1, is largely barren. It's dry, it's dusty, it requires humans to work the land to make it fertile. All of which is to say, Genesis 2 can't be day 6 of the previous chapter, right? When humans are created. Right? It's simply not the same world. This isn't day 6 of Genesis 1. This is day 1 of a totally new story. So in the story, God formed man from the dust of the earth and blew into his nostrils, etc. Okay, let's get the easy part out of the way. Here, the word man, as commonly translated, means one single human male, right? Which we don't know from some different Hebrew word. We only know it contextually because that's clearly what's happening in the rest of the story. The creation of this man from the dust of the earth is basically a pun, right? Man is Adam, and earth is Adama, right? Soil, ground. So Adam, man, comes from soil. So, there's a little wordplay in there, but this is also a very particular way of understanding the creation of humans. The verb that's used here for God forming this man, this is the verb that's used for an artisan, for a potter. Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, will use the same image in Isaiah 45. Woe to you who strive with your maker, and that's that word again. The same word as here for forming. Earthen vessels with the potter. Does the clay say to the one who fashions it, and I think that's the same word again, what are you making, or your work has no handles? So God here is, and it makes sense, right? Using the earth, right? It's the imagery of a potter, which is also, it just so happens, one of the words that's used regularly in the Bible for the making of idols. Right. So when we have the prophets condemning idolatry, they talk about, right, how, this isn't, you've not made a real God, right? It's just the work of your hands. It's something you made, right? Something you formed. Why is it interesting that it's the same word? Because what it suggests is that here, God is creating this man in a way analogous to the way that a human might make an idol, right? The taking of clay and the forming of something. And we even have from ancient Mesopotamia, we have texts that give us the sort of the ritual for investing the idol that you've just made with life, right? Turning it from just something you've shaped with your hands into the God that it is meant to sort of make present. I mean, we have whole ritual texts of this from Mesopotamia called the Mispi ritual, literally the washing of the mouth. And so here, God, in blowing life into this sort of clay being, is sort of replicating the making of idols known from the ancient Israelite context. Creation here is almost like, in that sense, almost like an anti-idolatry statement. Right? God does this. God creates shapes, human shapes, and blows life into them and gives them life. But we can't do this. Right? God creates life. We create lifeless objects and then pretend. Right? We play God when we do this sort of thing. Okay. On to our lovely garden in Eden. There is a lot of speculation floating around out there in the world as to where exactly the Garden of Eden may have been. Or to put it a different way, perhaps, where did the ancient Israelite author imagine or envision Eden to be? Very commonly, people will say it's Mesopotamia. People sometimes think of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as a potential reference. It might be Persia, some folks would say. There's a school of thought that thinks that the writer is envisioning Jerusalem, actually. But searching for where the Garden of Eden might have actually been is maybe something of a fool's errand. Not only because the story is sort of self-consciously mythological, right? That is, we know from the end that sort of the paths to the garden are closed and you can't get back there. And it's like, it's made to be a secret. It's not the kind of place you might stumble across accidentally. Nobody lives there now. But moreover, the text tells us in its description of Eden that there are 4 rivers. It's not important to, right? You don't have to memorize all 4 rivers. They won't be on the final exam. But when we look at the rivers, some of them we can identify and some of them we can't. But certainly the last 2 are the Tigris and the Euphrates. And the one before that, the Gihon, it says flows through the land of Cush. Now, the land of Cush is in Ethiopia, present day. Now, I'm not great at geography, but I don't think there are any rivers that go both through Mesopotamia and through Egypt. This is akin to sort of today telling a story about this, this mythic early place where like the Amazon and the Nile and like, all the great rivers of the world originally issued from there, right? We would be creating, to say that we would be creating sort of an aura for the reader of a mythical, original, like distant in time and place and concept, right? A not real place. So to say where might the Garden of Eden have been is kind of to read against the story as it's being presented to us. The garden is not, right, locatable. It's a special secret sort of place. And the most important thing, though, is to preserve the distinction between the garden in which God makes trees grow and the barren land that remains outside of it, right? All that dry, dusty earth that has no human to make anything grow, that's still out there outside the garden. It's only in the garden that stuff is growing sort of its own accord because God is making it happen. Speaking of trees, there are 2 trees in the garden. There's more than 2 trees in the garden. There are many trees in the garden. There are 2 trees in the middle of the garden. And it's good to understand what's up with these 2 trees. And we'll come back to it a little bit later also. But there's 2. There's the tree of knowledge and there's the tree of life. And only one of them is off limits. Right? Only the tree of knowledge is off limits. The tree of life, evidently, is totally fair game. So we might ask ourselves, did they just kind of like avoid that tree by chance the whole time? Were they eating from that tree regularly? I'm going to come back in a little bit to how I think the tree of life worked. But for now, as something to keep in mind moving forward, the intention seems to be clearly that they can eat from the tree of life. That is, immortality is definitely on the table, right? It's even potentially anticipated, right? That this, at least from this point, that this one human will live in this garden indefinitely. And this will matter to how we understand the story pretty darn soon. Once we've got the man wandering around in the garden, we get the creation of woman. Okay, so first, a language note, and one of my favorite little sort of language trivia bits in the entire Bible, and a wonderful example of just how dependent we modern English speakers are on the King James version. So the translation I have here, as I use regularly, is the Jewish publication one, but many of us may be used to the King James language here, which I will now add. Right, not a fitting helper for him, but the King James reads, "A help meet for him." This slightly weird phrase in the King James Bible became the English word helpmeet, like one word. Right? I will make a helpmeet for him. Right? A word which I don't think anybody really fully understood, which is why that word became more reasonably the word helpmate. Right? Which I think is still like reasonably a common word, at least common enough that it doesn't strike the ear as super weird. Right? She became a helpmate for him. Right? I can understand that. Right? A mate and a helpmate. Right? It's definitely better than helpmeet, but it's still kind of weird. So what is happening here? This all happened because English, I guess not particularly long after the King James, lost the use of the word meet that the King James is using here, which is the word meet meaning fitting. Shakespeare uses it the same way. Right? So the King James is translating it basically correctly, a help fitting for him. And instead of fitting, they used their word meet, a help meet for him. Right? So perfectly correct translation of the Hebrew, actually. But once we lost the meaning of meet, we ended up with the word helpmate, which never actually existed. Right? Which is, again, just a reminder that our English is so heavily influenced by the King James that we end up with words like helpmate that are derived from misunderstandings of what was, at the time, a totally plausible, reasonable translation. Okay, so now that we've decided to find a helpmeet for him, here come the animals. Now, this isn't what we read in Genesis 1, where all the birds are made on day 5 and all the animals are made on day 6, and all of them before humans. Here, all the animals are made at once, all still theoretically on day 1, and all after our one human was created. And you'll notice, by the way, that the animals are also made out of the earth, right? From the Adamah, using that same sort of potter artisanal term, right? God is, again, still like forming these living beings. And I also want to notice why, according to this story, why do animals exist in the world at all? And I mentioned this a little bit last time. In Genesis 1, animals pre-exist humans. They're blessed before humans are blessed, right? They have their own independent sort of being in the world. In Genesis 2, animals exist only for the sake of humanity, right? And only because, right, Adam might have been lonely and, had to produce a whole bunch of animals to see what would work, and nothing did. And we'll come back to that next week as a important little bit. Okay, third, what's actually happening here with how the woman is made? So rib is the common translation. The Hebrew doesn't technically say rib, though I'm not sure that I know what the biblical Hebrew word for rib would be. The term that's used is a little bit more abstract than that. Sometimes it's used for like a building beam. I think rib is still pretty likely, all things considered. But there's been lots of interesting debate over the years about exactly what's going on here. It's been argued that why did they say that it's taken from, she's made from the rib? Well, maybe it has something to do with, different rib cage structures of men and women. And it's an explanation for that. I don't know, maybe. The most outrageous theory that's like currently out there, apologies in advance, the most outrageous theory is that what this is meant to describe is the penis bone, which humans don't have, but basically every other animal does, right? Every other mammal does. And so this was supposed to be the explanation. Why do humans not have that particular bone? Well, because this is how woman was made. That is like a peer-reviewed, published argument out there in the world, which may just say something about standards of peer review. Actually, it's a perfectly fine argument. In any case, in both cases, what's being understood is that this rib bit is an etiology, right? It's an explanation for why things are the way they are. Why does man not have a certain bone? Why does the rib cage structure different between men and women? Uh, I don't think that's what's going on here at all. I might be wrong, but I don't read this as an attempt to explain something in our present. I think it's an attempt to explain something in the past that was otherwise kind of not explainable. If I have two animals, I know where the third animal comes from. If I have one human originally, how did we ever get a second human? Right? What's what's the like what's the theoretical logic? How could they possibly be explaining this to themselves? Right? It can't be through any of the mechanisms that animals reproduce, because there's only one, and I know we need more than one. But they did know how to create one plant from one pre-existing plant. And we do too, right? We call it just taking a cutting, right? You take a little bit of the stem or the right, you clip a little off the side of a plant and you plant it. And what you end up with is another of the same species of plant. And we may know that those two plants are genetically identical, but they didn't know what genetics were, so they didn't think that. But I sort of suspect that that's the image that's going on here in the author's mind, is essentially God is taking a cutting from Adam and creating Eve from it. And I think this fits well with sort of the broader agricultural imagery of this creation story. And so it's not really an etiology. How did something in our present happen? It's sort of just logic. How did we go from one to two? And they had a mechanism for it. It just wasn't a human mechanism. It was a plant mechanism. That's my minor theory. That also is a peer-reviewed article, which again may tell us something about the baseline for peer review. Okay, fourth, the famous proof text for heterosexual marriage that we get here in the story, which it is obviously not. Right? This isn't a command. Right? It's not commanding people to act a certain way. This is actually, I think, and I don't have to think, it's objectively on its face an explanation for a cultural phenomenon. Why is it that this happens? Right? But what's the it? Right? What it's talking about here isn't really so much marriage, I don't think, as it is, I think, about how kinship ties get formed. Right? Marriage creates kinship. Two different families become one flesh. So the son who has been created through one lineage now creates a new lineage with somebody from a different family. And I think kinship is more at stake here than marriage. What it's definitely not about is procreation. And we're going to get to that in just a second, sort of the super important part here. But before we get to that, we have to introduce our slithery friend, the snake. The major claim that the snake makes, the one that I've put here, is a claim that's absolutely true, evidently, is that eating from this fruit will open the human's eyes and make them like gods. Brief aside, what was the fruit of the tree of knowledge? Everyone goes, it's definitely not an apple, right? They didn't grow apples back then. That's true. It was probably a pomegranate. They grew pomegranates back then. That's also true that they grew pomegranates back then, but the Bible knows how to say pomegranate, right? Pomegranates grow from, I assume, pomegranate trees. I don't know, I've never seen one. But the tree of knowledge probably grows fruit of knowledge tree, knowledge fruit. In other words, it's like finding out where the Garden of Eden is. It's a little bit of a silly enterprise to try and figure out which fruit it was. If you're a painter, I guess you got to choose one. Those of us who are reading the story, if it doesn't bother telling us, it's a little bit, not necessary for us to try and figure it out. Okay. So eating will open the human's eyes and make them like gods. The trait that's associated with divinity here is judgment and discernment. Right? This is what animals lack, right? Mere animals don't have this quality. And you'll note the language here that associates seeing and knowledge, right? This is so typical, we almost look right past it. Look right past it, pun intended. We almost look right past it, but this is a good place, I think, to just stop for a second and recognize how our brains are sort of metaphorically wired. Sight here equals knowledge. Like that seems very natural to us. Lack of sight, by contrast, signals ignorance, right? Their eyes are closed so they don't know stuff. And that shows up elsewhere. We can think ahead into Genesis of, poor blind Isaac getting tricked by Jacob, right? Blindness involves lack of knowledge. Now, we could, if we wanted to, sort of interrogate what we would today call like the ableist assumptions of the kind of language that associates sight and knowledge. But we might also recognize that though the Bible may be very consistent that sight and knowledge go together, that's not sort of a universal human truth. You may think of some of your famous Greek myths where it is like the old blind Tiresias, right? Who is the one who sees all the things. So there's not always a one-to-one correspondence. All right, when their eyes are opened, these two people, what do they immediately know? The first thing they know is shame. And again, it's about the difference between humans and animals. Right? Animals just don't feel shame. Certainly not about their nakedness. Did these two humans suddenly gain sexual knowledge, as is long assumed? Not necessarily, I don't think. Again, it's about the contrast with animals. Were all the animals celibate? I guess probably not. When all the animals learned to procreate or learned to sort of have sex, is it because they ate from this tree and they were like, oh, I guess we should mate? Like, again, probably not. So I don't know that the sexual knowledge thing works so well. And again, we'll come back to that again. But you'll note that clothing here is sort of recognized as the first sign of human culture, the thing that first distinguishes us from the animals. It has to do with shame, really. When they are discovered to have eaten from the tree, we get like the verses called the blame game. I am always amazed that traditional interpreters of this text side with Adam. Like, could this dude be any more obviously petty and childlike? Like, take some responsibility, dude. And to be fair, we are about to enter into the part of this text where patriarchal interpretation has been incredibly dominant and super influential. And it starts right here, right? Who is to blame for everything that happened here? Adam is the one who got the command directly from God not to eat from that tree, right? So what's his argument here, right? Essentially, it's like if she told him to jump off a bridge, would he? But like somehow the history of interpretation has decided that she's the main sinner here. Like, okay, somehow the history of interpretation. I think we all know how she ended up being the main sinner here. Right? It doesn't take too much effort to figure out. Okay. The serpent gets his legs taken away. That's fine and easy. We understand what's happening there. It doesn't really require comment. What I want to focus on here, as we move toward toward the back end here, I really want to focus on what is said to the woman, and a little bit less so to the man after they've been caught, and especially to the woman, because my reading of this is not at all what is traditionally held when it comes to what this text means. And I'm going to try and make a case for it. And even if you don't agree, I hope it's thought-provoking. So this curse, and I'm not even sure that curse is really the right word, but this curse is almost always understood, as in this translation, which is again the JPS, almost always understood to be that from this point on, women will suffer pain in childbirth. I will make most severe your pangs in childbearing. In pain shall you bear children. That reading assumes that prior to this moment, childbirth would have been painless, at least relatively painless. And that understanding, by the way, is the origin of the tradition that Jesus's birth was painless for Mary. Um, right? Mary, who also like is free of sin, therefore is free of the pain in childbirth that goes along with it. So that's a whole line of interpretation that's again centered on this understanding of this curse. But why would we think that prior to this moment, childbirth would have been painless? Better, why would we assume that prior to this moment, there was childbirth at all? Right? Remember, these are two people who live in a garden and have access to a tree of life. If they're procreating, where are all of their offspring going to go? Right, they're presumably immortal offspring also. Um, Again, I think, tend to think that there was theoretically childbirth before this curse because of Genesis 1:28, right? Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, right? So of course there was childbirth. God said, be fruitful and multiply. But Adam and Eve can't be trying to fulfill this blessing / command, right? They can't fill the earth. They live in a garden. Right? They don't live out there in the earth. They could fill a garden, maybe. Probably not, wouldn't take them too long either. They'll fill a garden, so they can't fill the earth, nor are they subduing the earth in any way. Again, they just wander around the garden picking fruit from a tree. They're not subduing anything. Genesis 1 assumes fertility from the very beginning. Be fruitful and multiply. Genesis 2 clearly doesn't. Adam was created alone to live in solitude forever. Right? That was the plan, at least. Um, Eve wasn't created to be a procreative partner. It says explicitly, right, as a helper, a companion. Animals were okay as possibilities, right? Like if Adam had been okay with just some pets, right, we wouldn't have needed Eve at all. Um, so again, if the notion was originally that this one guy was going to live in this, enclosed garden eternally, for sure there was no childbirth intended. And even once Eve is created, right, before God speaks to her and says this, Adam and Eve are intended to live forever in Eden. Right? That's the plan. They have access to the tree of life. They should be sitting there in that garden forever. If they hadn't eaten from the tree of knowledge, what would have happened? They would have lived in the garden in an eternal state of childlessness. If that's the situation, what does it mean to tell her, now you're going to have pain in childbirth? Like, she might reasonably be like, sorry, pain in what? Right? It's a new thing. I want to look ahead momentarily to Adam's curse, because I think it's a good analogy, right? What is Adam's curse? Adam's curse isn't that he's condemned to harder labor than he had before. Right? He had no labor before. He lived in the garden where everything grew for him. Right? Adam's punishment is having to work for his food at all. Right? The toil is the punishment. In Adam's case, the toil is to grow food to survive. And so too for the woman. Her punishment isn't harder labor than she had before in the childbirth sense of labor. It's not harder labor. Her punishment is just labor. The man's task is to provide food, and the woman's task is to provide offspring to help with the man's task. And this is more visible if we translate the Hebrew literally, right? Every translation you see like this is an interpretive translation, because the literal translation of the Hebrew is, I will make many your toils and your pregnancies. Right? So again, here's what everyone reads it as. I will make most severe your pangs in childbirth. And it really says, I will make many your toils and your pregnancies. The word pain doesn't occur anywhere in the Hebrew. That's the word that people are translating the word toil, labor, as pain. So this is a really wonderful example of how interpretation affects translation, and then that translation in turn affects our interpretation. Right? So the woman's change is not from easy pregnancy to hard pregnancy. It's from childless woman to mother. And her name change signals this, right? The man named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all the living. He names her this only after she's gotten this curse, right? This punishment. She wasn't a mother before, right? But she will be a mother now. That's her change in status, is a change to motherhood. So Eve's curse is not that she will experience pain in childbirth. It's that she will become pregnant in the first place, which is to say, this isn't a curse about her fertility. This is a curse of fertility. Okay. What we also don't have here, and I can't stress this enough, is any notion of original sin. Right? Original sin does not exist in the story of Genesis. It doesn't exist in anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. It doesn't really exist in the New Testament either. Right? The whole conceptual complex of original sin belongs to the history of Christian interpretation. It's not here, and no amount of digging will ever find it because Augustine invented it, right, in like the 4th century. So it's not going to show up before him. Augustine has a lot to do with a lot of the ways that this chapter is read and understood. To my mind, none of them particularly great. Okay, so this whole story, as I come to the end here, this whole story of Genesis 2 and 3, it exists not to focus on the paradise that was lost, as it were, but rather on the reality that we see around us. Why is it, the story asks, why is it that we have to work the ground to get food? Why doesn't it just grow for us? Right? And again, that's a particularly pressing question in Israel, where you have to work so hard to get the food out of the ground. Why do we have to have children in order to provide labor? Why don't we live forever? Right? These are the questions. Speaking of why don't we live forever? Once Adam and Eve have eaten from the tree of knowledge, suddenly God is scared. Right? What if now they eat from the tree of life? Now, does that suggest that they hadn't eaten from the tree of life yet? But before this, it seems clear that they were expected to live forever, so maybe they had eaten from the tree of life. So I think that it helps here to distinguish between the two trees. The tree of knowledge is like, the tree of life, I guess, is not a like one bite deal. It's not a you take a bite from the fruit of the tree of life and you now live forever. It's the kind of thing where like you keep eating from it and you keep living, right? Like a fountain of youth sort of thing. It also helps here, I think, to think of godliness or godlikeness as entailing two things, right? Knowledge and immortality. That's what makes a divine being, right? It has greater knowledge than us, and it has immortality. And the story tells us you can have either one, but you can't have both. So once they eat from the tree of knowledge, which is a one bite deal, right? You eat from it and now you know the things. Once they've eaten from the tree of knowledge, the tree of life and eternal life are now off the table because you can't have both. They had one, they chose the other. The whole story is the explanation for why life is hard. And again, particularly the kind of agricultural, difficult life that ancient Israelites were accustomed to. Why is life hard? This story is the explanation. But it's also not all bad, right? What the story opens the door to our world, right? The world we live in with all of its joys and its sorrows and its pleasantness and its labors. Right? This story is the inauguration, the beginning of human culture. Start with clothing and we go from there. This is why we're different from animals. It's not because of original sin, it's because of an original choice, the choice of knowledge over immortality. And I bet, faced with those two options, most of us would make the same choice. Okay, I'm going to take a break now. I'm not going to take a break. I'm just going to stop talking about my own things, and I'm going to answer some of the questions that have been coming in, if I can see some of them. Okay, so the final exam thing I said was a joke. There is no final exam. So want to make sure everybody's clear on that. So let's see. I said original sin isn't found here, and I think that there's been some reaction to that. Right, there's original sin isn't here. What is the notion of original sin? The notion of original sin, as I understand it, is that having done this, having sinned in this way, and of course it doesn't say sin anywhere in this chapter, but having done this wrong thing, now every human that is born is born of sin and is born into a sinful state that requires redemption. Like it's just not here, right? It doesn't say anything about humans being born into any negative state. It doesn't say anything about redemption. That whole notion of humans requiring redemption by their very nature is simply not in the Hebrew Bible really anywhere. So when we read that and we recognize like just how very Christian a concept that is, it may not be obvious to everybody just how Christian it is, but it is, right? Judaism has no similar concept, and it really, like, we can trace it right back to Augustine, who sort of created that whole idea complex for us. Okay, a couple of people asked questions about the snake saying, right, you will be like gods, plural, right? And somebody said, is this perhaps, this is commonly understood as a reference to the Trinity, but more sort of broadly, right, what is going on with this plural of gods? Now, I don't want to spend too much time like going down too many deep, dark roads here. I will say this. The interpretation of this as the Trinity is one that is clearly specific to Christianity. And I'm going to put out there sort of a principle, which is, if one's reading or understanding of the biblical text is one that is comprehensible only from within one modern or post-biblical system of religious belief, right? If an interpretation makes sense only if you are Christian, then it's probably an interpretation that comes out of Christianity rather than out of the biblical text itself. It's a pretty good general rule. The same is basically true for Judaism, but especially, right, when if you read the text and you say this has been interpreted as reference to the Trinity, it sure has, and it's not a wrong interpretation. It's a specific interpretation, right? Specific to one religious community, right? And it's telling us something about the interpretation rather than something about the text underlying it. But what is this God's plural thing? It's the same. It's, in theory, could be the same thing we saw in Genesis 1, right? When God says, let us make man in our image, right? Who's the us and the our? Right? There's a divine court, right? There's more divine beings in the imagined heavens than just one God. So that's one read. And the other one, the like deeper, darker, secret read, is they weren't monotheists, right? We're monotheists. But like the people who wrote this story were almost certainly not. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't worship the God of Israel, right? But they also understood that there were plenty of gods out there. I know the names of most of the gods out there, right? I know the name of the God of my nation and the God of the next nation and the God of the next nation, right? Like I know the names of all the gods of all the. Right? What are all of these gods like? Are they all fake? No. They just like. Anyway, this is a bigger question that perhaps I'll get to at a different time. But I will simply put out there as one of those annoying, like, I'm going to say something enormously huge right now, and I'm going to let you sit on it for a while. Monotheism didn't enter Israelite conception or consciousness, I think, until the late 6th century BCE. This text, and I think most of all of Genesis, is from earlier than that. And perhaps we'll have a chance to come back to other places where it's sort of clear that our modern concept of the deity, and there's plenty of them, but our modern concept of the deity is not the same as their concept of the deity. And that's okay. That's totally okay. But, they say gods, and they're like, yeah, all the gods, this is what the gods are like. My God, your God, their God, right? This is what gods are like. And we recoil because we don't think that way anymore. And it's good for us to be aware of that. Okay. Let me see here. So lots of questions about the snake, right? Who is obviously Satan? No, that's also Christian interpretation, right? Hebrew Bible doesn't really have Satan, not like that. Right, that Satan is right. The Satan who is like the devil Satan. That Satan is a Christian entity. The Hebrew Bible has the word comes from Hebrew, right? Satan. But some of you may know, right? The word Satan in the Hebrew Bible doesn't mean devil or any being like that. It's a generic word for it's a role, right? It's the adversary. It's like the opposing counsel, is what the Satan is. And so the serpent was not imagined to be the devil in this context. The serpent is, though, clearly was understood, as I think it is in all cultures, as sort of like wily, clever, crafty, right? In part because like it moves like this. There's something sort of natural to it that I think makes people, it lies in wait, and it bites people unexpectedly. It's nasty little creatures, just except for the little garden ones. But so I think that it's sort of a question of like just killing a bunch of birds with one stone. How is it that the people were convinced to do this? Well, there must have been, somebody must have convinced them. The only creatures around are the other animals, who I guess talk sometimes, like only the snake and only once. Although there are occasional talking animals in the Bible, right? Later on, the prophet Balaam will have a nice conversation with his donkey in the book of Numbers. But it's right. This is the world of mythology. Again, this is not meant to be realistic necessarily, right? This is Aesop's fables, right? Where the snake tricks the person. Snakes are. Somebody asked, where did the snake get its knowledge from? The snake is inherently crafty, right? That's the assumption, right? It even tells us snake was like the craftiest of all the creatures God created. So it's in a sense, the snake is like a plot device, but it's also clearly getting at a background in which snakes were authentically dangerous, right? Elsewhere in the Bible, snakes are are poisonous, and snakes are creatures that live in the wilderness that attack, and so that they have a negative view of snakes already, and you combine that with sort of the way they move, and they look very wily and crafty. Okay. I'm going to leave. I know there's so many snake questions. I'm going to leave some of the snake questions aside because so many snake questions. Other things that we have here. Right. I want to get back to, somebody asked, the question of, is what's going on in verses 3:16-19, that is where the woman's punishment of childbirth, and the snake being on its being on its belly, and man having to work the ground. What I sort of said, I don't really like to use the word curse for these, even though it's traditionally what they're called. Right. My reluctance is that I think, again, that these stories are not about, the story isn't really about like fall and punishment. Again, I think that's like sort of a later Christian interpretive move. As I said, the whole story is an explanation for why things are the way they are. Why do women get pregnant? Why do we have to work the land? Why does a snake crawl on its belly? Right? These are essentially, why does our world look the way it does? This is the story that explains it. It's not again, and I think that's the focus. The focus isn't on, we are all cursed, we're all sinful. Again, that's Augustine was really into that as a concept, but I don't think it's really native to the text. It's interesting that the snake gets things a little right and a little wrong. Right? Somebody said, what about the part where the snake says, where God says, as soon as you eat of the tree, you die? Well, and the snake is like, did God really say that? That's not true. When you eat, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like gods. The snake actually says mostly true things. And there's a question as to whether, when God says, when you eat of it, you're going to die, is God not being totally right? Is that like when I say, if you bully your sister, I'm going to take your screens away for a week, but I don't mean it really? I don't think so. I think we need to sort of ask ourselves just how literally we're taking this. It is true. As soon as they eat from the tree of knowledge, they become mortal, right? Death becomes part of their existence. Do they die that instant? No. Do they become dying creatures? Yes. Right. That's their new state. Okay. A question that was asked about dating the authorship of this text. I think this text was written sometime between the 9th, 10th century BCE at the earliest, and the 6th century BC, probably near the latest, somewhere in there. And my dating of it has almost nothing to do with this text in particular, right? Because I'm not actually, I don't think that like this little Garden of Eden story was floating around out there by itself. It's part of a much larger whole. The story will continue, right? The same characters that we meet here will continue into chapter 4 with Cain and Abel, and and everything that goes on there. So, and it will continue on from there. So there's a whole longer story. There's nothing about this text in particular that makes it datable to then. It's the entire story of which it's a part that belongs to that. what I just described was what we call the pre-exilic period. That is the period of Israelite culture before the destruction of the first temple and the Babylonian exile at the beginning of the 6th century. So that's when I think this was written, which is really broad, but again is basically going to be my answer for almost all of the book of Genesis, even in all the various parts that I'm going to talk about it in. If me talking about this raises for you questions about authorship of the Bible, right? And obviously I've talked about Genesis 1 as one creation story, and Genesis 2 that we've read today is a second creation story, and they have all these contradictions. Obviously something's going on with who's writing the Bible, and I'm going to talk about that in much greater depth next time. So the question of, did Moses write it? The question of how did it come to be? What are the, what are these multiple authors? I'm going to get into some of that at least next time. That is what I do professionally. Like that is my main biblical bag, is talking about who's writing this stuff. But I kind of don't want to spend our entire 8 weeks just asking that question. We'll do it next time because it's going to come up real strong in the flood, and then it might pop up again here and there. But I'll do an overview next week. Somebody just asked a really interesting question. Did the editors of Genesis, and now we're already sort of talking about sort of issues of composition and editing, but did the editors of Genesis intend for it to be a religious text? And that's a really interesting question because it gets at a fundamental difference between now and then. Now we distinguish between a religious anything and a secular anything. And essentially one of the things that we try and keep in mind when thinking about the world of ancient Israel and just the ancient world generally is there was no such thing as secular. And in a sense, there are people who will tell you secularism is a very, very recent modern phenomenon. But was it intended to? Of course it was a religious text. It's a text about their God and about their relationship with their God and about, explaining, the origins of things, and always through the lens of supernatural, what we call supernatural. They didn't have natural and supernatural, right? Like rain, we are like, rain is natural. Rain for them was from God. Weather is from God. Agriculture, everything was explainable through what we call a religious lens, and they would just call a lens, right? So yes, a religious text by our standards, but not if what we mean by that is, did they intend it to be read by like religious communities as opposed to non-religious communities? There was no such thing as a non-religious community, right? There just wasn't a thing that existed. Okay, I'm looking at the time and I see that it's 9 o'clock. And I see there's so many good questions out there. I'm sorry I can't get to all of them. I may, I may try and answer one or two in the email that goes out later this week. But really enjoyable, terrific questions. Please keep them coming. I really appreciate having the chance to sort of see what's resonating and how the interacting is going for you. Next time, we're going to skip Cain and Abel, because if we did every story, we would only get through Genesis 10. So we're going to skip Cain and Abel, and we're going to skip Genesis 5, which is all genealogy. We're going to go right to the flood story, which is kind of unavoidable. So the reading is therefore Genesis 6 through 9, basically. And again, of course, go to the Yale Bible Study website to see the conversation, to read the study guide and any other sorts of resources that we have there for you. And I will see you back here in a week. Thanks, everybody.